On a bright, bitter ridge above Lake Superior, a wounded FBI agent hid in a hilltop cabin, trying to outrun a failed mission and the memories it left behind. She had stopped believing in miracles until a sable German shepherd appeared at her door, dragging a wounded Navy SEAL through the snow like destiny had teeth. Then the air itself turned dangerous, and a chemical stench from Reynolds Hall began to thread its way into her life like a warning from God. 2 SEALs were still missing, and the men who wanted silence were already climbing the hill to take back the truth. If you believe hope can arrive on 4 paws, say Amen. Where are you watching from? And will you like, subscribe, and stay with us? Early winter sat bright and quiet over Minnesota's North Shore, the kind of cold that didn't scream but simply stayed, polishing the world until everything looked clean and sharp. From the ridge above Lake Superior, Claire Wren's small cabin caught the morning like a lone lantern, its porch light set to flick on with motion, its chimney sending up a thin ribbon of smoke that said to anyone watching from the woods, life still lived here. Claire was 30, lean and athletic in the way of someone trained to move with purpose, not decoration. Her dark brown hair was usually pulled back low, practical and slightly messy, as if she didn't trust mirrors anymore. She had steady blue-gray eyes that could read a room in a heartbeat, but lately those eyes often looked past rooms, past people, into places she couldn't name. A failed operation had left her on forced leave. Rest, the Bureau called it, as if rest could be scheduled like a report. The truth was heavier, the kind of memories that came uninvited, the kind that made silence feel safer than conversation. So she lived with routines, wood stacked tight, boots by the door, kettle filled, radio low, and tried to make peace with a life that didn't ask her to be brave. That morning she was halfway through rinsing a mug when the porch light clicked on by itself, a pale flare against the snow, and she froze with the old reflex of someone who had learned that small changes were often the start of something worse. She didn't rush. She listened first. The cabin held its own sounds, the stove ticking, the wind brushing pine needles, the faint groan of wood settling. Then came a scrape, short, deliberate, followed by another, not frantic, not random, as if whoever was outside knew exactly where the door met the frame. Claire moved to the window, careful to keep her silhouette small, and saw a German shepherd on the porch, female, about 5 years old, sable coat darkened by snow, built lean and strong like a working dog rather than a pampered pet. Frost dusted her muzzle. Her ears were forward, her posture straight, and her eyes held a focused intelligence that made Claire's chest tighten in a way she didn't like. This dog wasn't pleading. She was reporting. She scratched once more, then stepped back and looked over her shoulder toward the slope, then back at Claire as if saying, "Now, follow." Claire should have stayed inside. She knew that. She also knew the strange truth of her own wiring. She could ignore people, but she couldn't ignore a sentinel. Outside, the cold bit, clean and fast. The dog hopped off the porch and trotted a few yards, then stopped, waiting, patient but urgent. Claire followed down the packed path where the snow had been tamped by her boots and weeks of habit. The sunlight was almost cheerful, the kind that made the lake beyond the trees shine like hammered steel. Halfway down the slope, the dog veered into a shallow dip where the ground leveled out, and Claire saw what the dog had been doing before she arrived. A man on a silver-gray space blanket, the blanket itself laid over a tan poncho, edges tied into a crude harness. The dog had been gripping a strap with her teeth, pulling the load in short, controlled slides across the firm snow, only on the gentler grade, then abandoning the pull when the incline rose too steep. That was why she'd come to the cabin. She'd done everything she could alone. Now she needed hands. A sharp, invisible sting hit Claire's eyes, like sliced onions turned cruel, and for half a second the world blurred, bright snow smearing into white fire as a harsh chemical tang rode the cold air and made her throat seize. She stopped. She forced a breath. The dog pressed close, shoulder against Claire's leg, steadying her like a living brace, then turned her head to the man as if insisting the mission mattered more than the discomfort. The smell was wrong, industrial, bitter. Not the forest, not wood smoke, not blood. Claire blinked hard until the light came back into focus, and she dropped into a crouch beside the man. He was big, early 40s, broad through the shoulders even under layers of snow-dusted clothing. Dark hair cut short, a day or two of stubble outlining a square jaw. His face had the hard angles of someone who'd lived with discipline. Cheekbones set, mouth firm, eyes that even half-lidded seemed trained to measure distance. His lips were slightly blue at the edges. One glove was missing. A bruise darkened his temple, and his breathing came shallow but steady. Claire felt for a pulse and found it, stronger than she expected. His eyelids fluttered, and he tried to speak. The words came out broken, more breath than sound. "Don't just me." The dog stood at Claire's shoulder, not whining, not pacing, simply watching, ears flicking toward the trees and back again, like she was counting seconds. Claire didn't argue with what her instincts already knew. She got her arms under him, felt the weight, the stiffness of cold in his clothes, and dragged him the last steep stretch toward the cabin, using the poncho as a skid while the dog stayed close, ready to block the path behind them. Inside, warmth wrapped around them like a mercy. Claire moved with the calm efficiency she trusted more than feelings. Door bolted, stove fed, blankets layered. She stripped off her own outer jacket and tucked it around his chest, then started warming water and speaking to a dispatcher with a voice that didn't tremble. She didn't say Navy SEAL out loud, she didn't know that yet, but she saw it in the way his body held itself even in collapse, like a trained machine refusing to quit. The dog stayed near the threshold, posture low but controlled, eyes tracking every shadow that passed the window. When Claire leaned in to adjust the man's collar, the chemical odor rose again, harsher near the fabric. The dog immediately nudged her forearm away with her muzzle, then shifted her body between Claire and the stained cloth. It wasn't aggression, it was prevention, the way a good partner stops you from stepping on thin ice. Claire swallowed, irritation in her throat, and used a towel instead, careful not to press her face close. As the man's breathing steadied, she searched his pockets for identification. What she found wasn't a wallet. It was a broken access badge, snapped at one corner, smeared faintly, as if it had been grabbed in a hurry. Northlake State University was printed across the top, and beneath it, in smaller letters, Reynolds Hall. Claire's stomach tightened with the familiar sensation of pieces aligning into something she didn't want to see. She moved to the window and looked down toward the dip in the snow where the man had been. The dog followed, silent. In the bright morning light, Claire saw what the forest tried to hide. Shallow boot prints that weren't hers, cut clean through the crust in a line too direct to be wandering, and near the tree line, a faint track where a vehicle had turned around, treads pressed and then partially feathered by wind. Someone had been close. Someone had left recently. Claire's hand found the bolt on the door again, and she slid it into place with a soft click that sounded in that moment like a prayer made practical. By late morning, the cabin had settled into a strange new rhythm, warmth against the windows, the steady tick of the stove, and the soft, fragile sound of a man breathing like he had borrowed time and didn't want to return it yet. Claire kept moving because stillness was where the past found her. She checked the blankets, adjusted the distance from the fire, watched Owen Mercer's lips for color and his chest for a steady rise. He was built like a man who had spent years carrying weight without complaint. Broad shoulders, thick forearms, a jaw set hard even in sleep. His dark hair lay damp against his temples, and the bruising at his head had deepened into a purple shadow. When he stirred, his eyelids lifted with effort, as if waking required permission from pain. His gaze flicked once toward the door, then toward the window, and Claire saw the same thing she'd seen the night her career cracked open. A mind that never stopped scanning, even when the body begged to shut down. The German shepherd stayed near the threshold like a silent guard. She was 5 years old, sable-coated with a dark saddle across her back, lean in the ribs but powerful through the hips. And her eyes held a disciplined seriousness that made her look less like a pet and more like a professional. Snow had melted into fine beads along her whiskers. She didn't pace or whine. She listened. Every few minutes her ears angled toward the trees, then back to Claire, as if checking that Claire understood her job now, too. The sheriff arrived first. Nora Kincaid stepped inside with a cautious confidence, tall and straight-backed, early 40s, the kind of woman whose posture was shaped by years of deciding things quickly. Her blonde hair was cut into a practical bob under a knit cap, and her face was weathered in that honest North Shore way. Wind-reddened cheeks, clear gray eyes, and a mouth that didn't waste words. She looked at Owen, then at Claire, and her expression softened just a fraction. "Ambulance is 10 minutes out," she said, voice steady. "Road's slow. Plow only came through once." Then her gaze dropped to the broken university badge on the table. Her jaw tightened. "That's not from around here." She didn't ask Claire why she had it. She didn't ask for a story yet. She just took in the details like a woman who knew stories arrived whether you invited them or not. When the porch light clicked again, Claire's shoulders tensed. But this time it was not the dog, and not the wind. A vehicle's tires crunched on packed snow outside, slow and deliberate, and a man stepped onto the porch carrying a case that looked too neat for the wilderness. Special Agent Jonah Pike introduced himself with the calm tone of someone used to stepping into chaos without becoming part of it. He was 33, medium height, athletic, but not bulky, with short light brown hair combed back like he still cared about discipline, even off the clock. His eyes were a steady hazel, thoughtful rather than hard, and he had the kind of face that looked younger until you noticed the lines around the mouth, the subtle wear of a man who'd learned to stay composed while other people fell apart. He wore a dark winter parka with a small FBI patch tucked low, not displayed like a badge, and his movements were economical, practiced. He didn't treat Claire like a hero. He didn't treat her like a liability. He treated her like a witness who had survived something important. "Field office got your call," he said gently. "You're on leave, Claire. I'm here to carry the paper and the responsibility." He let that land like a hand on a shoulder, firm, not cruel. "You tell me what happened. I'll make it official." A sudden metallic clack sounded from the kitchen counter, sharp, wrong in the quiet, when the broken badge slipped and struck the edge of a pot, and the dog's head snapped up so fast it looked like a switch had flipped, her ears rigid, her body angling between the front door and Claire as if the sound itself had been a warning shot. For one suspended heartbeat, even the stove seemed to hush. Then the moment passed, but it left a cold ribbon of certainty in Claire's gut. Someone else was in this story, and they were moving. Owen tried to sit up when he heard Jonah's voice, then stopped as pain washed through him. Claire steadied him with a folded towel instead of her bare hand, mindful of the chemical tang that still clung to his clothes. His eyes found Jonah, measured him, then flicked to the dog. A faint tension eased in his brow, as if seeing her there confirmed something he'd feared might be gone. "Luna," he rasped, barely audible. The dog didn't move, but her gaze softened in a way only Claire noticed, like a soldier allowing herself one quiet breath. Jonah's eyes narrowed slightly at the name, not demonstrating curiosity, just cataloging. Owen swallowed and spoke in short fragments, each word costing him. He'd been running. He'd gotten away by luck and darkness and the dog's insistence. But he wasn't the only one. 2 of his teammates, men who had trained with him, bled with him, were still held, hostages, leverage. They wanted something Owen had seen, something recorded, something that could tie a powerful person to an illegal operation. They said, "Evidence," Owen managed. "Not just the lab. Something that proves it." Claire felt her stomach drop, because proof was what made people dangerous when they thought it was about to surface. Jonah didn't push Owen beyond what his body could give. He asked precise questions anyway: where, when, names, sounds, routes, then stopped at the right edge and shifted to what he could control. He photographed the broken badge, logged it. He bagged the poncho corner that had a faint chemical scent, careful not to breathe too close. Sheriff Nora watched with her arms folded, sharp and protective, glancing to the window every time the dog's ears twitched. "You said you saw tracks," Nora told Claire. "Show us." Claire grabbed her coat, and Jonah followed, pulling on gloves with the calm urgency of a man who understood that snow erased stories quickly. At the tree line, the dog moved first. She didn't sprint. She flowed, nose low, tail steady, a purposeful search pattern that spoke of training rather than panic. Claire felt a quiet, unsettling admiration. This wasn't a dog wandering. This was a dog working. Luna stopped near a stand of brush, pawed once, then looked back at Claire like she was presenting an answer. Jonah crouched, careful, and found what her paw had uncovered. A single glove, black, not Owen's. It carried a faint, bitter tang like the one that stung Claire's eyes earlier, and beneath it, something else. Human sweat, unfamiliar, the ghost of a stranger's presence. "That's our first solid lead," Jonah murmured, voice low as prayer. He sealed it without ceremony. Sheriff Nora stared into the woods as if she could see the men who'd left it behind. "I'll put patrol on your road," she said. "No one comes up here unnoticed." Back inside, Jonah stepped aside to make the calls that turned a terrifying morning into an official case. His voice stayed level, but Claire caught the edge of urgency beneath it. Hostages meant exigent circumstances. It meant fast paperwork, fast coordination, and the kind of help that arrived wearing different patches. "DEA diversion," he said into the phone, glancing at the broken Reynolds Hall badge. "And hazmat standby, possible chemical precursor exposure. We'll need decon protocols for evidence handling." Claire sat down hard on the edge of a chair, the cabin spinning for a second with the weight of it. Owen, still half-conscious, reached toward Luna, as if anchoring himself to what was real. The dog stayed beside him, then turned her head and looked at Claire. Steady, intent, as if making a simple, unspoken agreement. "You saved my person. Now I will save yours, too." Outside, the wind moved gently through the pines, and the bright morning kept shining like it hadn't noticed how quickly the world had changed. Reynolds Hall looked almost innocent from the outside, a long brick building softened by snow and morning sunlight, the university's banners snapping gently in a clean wind as if they were advertising nothing more dangerous than lectures and coffee. But as Claire stepped from Jonah Pike's SUV into the parking lot, the air changed. It was subtle at first, an edge in the cold that didn't belong to pine or lake or exhaust. Then it sharpened, and her eyes watered without permission. The smell carried a harsh, metallic sweetness that made the back of her throat tighten, the way cheap bleach does when it's too concentrated, only this was worse, meaner, more insistent. Students were spilling out of the main doors in uneven waves, some coughing into sleeves, some blinking hard with red-rimmed eyes, faces pale with confusion and irritation. Claire stayed where Jonah told her to stay, in the warm zone behind a line of cones and tape, because today she was not the agent in charge. Today she was the witness, the one who had opened a cabin door and stepped into a case that now belonged to a bigger machine. She wrapped her scarf higher and watched that machine unfold. The hazmat team moved like a small army of careful ghosts. They wore full protective suits that made their bodies look rounded and anonymous, and their voices came through radios in clipped, practiced bursts. One of them, a woman with a stocky build and purposeful movements, stepped out of her mask long enough to speak to Jonah. Her name tag read Captain Maya Anders, and her hair, dark and tightly braided, was tucked under her hood like she had long ago decided vanity had no place in this work. Her eyes were sharp and assessing, and her tone held the authority of someone who had seen what invisible things could do to lungs and skin. "We've got a confirmed irritant release," she said. "We're treating it as benzyl chloride until lab confirms. It's a nasty one. Don't let anyone wander." Jonah nodded, calm, absorbing. He had that same steady posture Claire remembered from the Bureau's best. People who did not waste motion when lives might hinge on minutes. DEA arrived next, quiet but unmistakable. A man in a dark parka approached the command post with a folder held tight against his chest. He was in his late 30s, tall and lanky, with sandy hair cut short and a narrow face that looked permanently tired, as if he'd been awake for years listening to people lie. His name was Special Agent Rafael Rafe Delgado, and he had the careful eyes of someone who knew paperwork could be as dangerous as weapons. "Benzyl chloride isn't illegal by itself," he said, voice low. "But it's tracked. Orders, quantities, who signed, where it went. If someone's playing cute with procurement, we'll see it." Claire heard the calm certainty in his tone, and it made her think of Owen's broken sentence. Evidence, not just a lab. Proof that forced the truth into daylight. The university officials hovered at the edges, nervous birds around a storm. Then the cameras showed up, and with them, Dr. Elias Rowe. He looked like the kind of man who enjoyed being looked at, mid-50s, tall and trim, in an expensive wool coat that still carried a hint of cologne despite the cold. His silver-streaked hair was combed back neatly, his beard trimmed to a thoughtful academic shape. His smile was polite and practiced, and it sat on his face like a mask he'd worn for years. He spoke to reporters as if he were offering comfort, palms open, voice smooth. "Safety is our highest priority," he said, eyes shining with performance. "We're cooperating fully. These things happen in any research environment." Claire watched him and felt something in her chest go cold, not from the weather. The words were perfect. The timing was perfect. The ease was almost too perfect. Jonah didn't comment, but she saw him note it. The way Rowe's gaze kept sliding toward the building as if he wanted to make sure certain doors stayed closed. Then Luna arrived, not as a civilian dog trotting wherever she pleased, but as a working canine under a handler's control. The handler was a broad-shouldered deputy named Tom Heller, early 40s, with a thick brown beard and a weathered face that looked carved by wind. His eyes were kind but focused, and his hands were steady on the leash, in the way of a man who understood the animal at the other end was not a pet, but a partner. Luna's sable coat gleamed even under the gray light, her ears forward, her nose already working the air. She moved with quiet discipline, tail level, body angled toward duty. Claire's chest loosened by half an inch at the sight. Something in her believed the dog more than it believed people. A sudden gust shoved the main doors open, harder than the staff intended, and a wave of that bitter chemical stench rolled out like an invisible slap. Students recoiled, a reporter stumbled back, and Luna's whole body snapped into rigid stillness. Paw lifted mid-step as if time itself had paused. For one silent beat, the world held its breath, and Claire felt the uncanny certainty of it. The dog had just heard something with her nose that no one else could. Then Luna moved again, pulling not toward the crowds, but toward a side service corridor half hidden behind a maintenance entrance. Heller kept her on a short lead. "Easy," he murmured, not as a command to calm down, but as guidance to stay precise. Jonah stayed at the edge of the allowed zone, coordinating with Captain Anders. They weren't sending the dog into danger, they were letting the dog point. Luna paced a small arc near the maintenance door, nose low, then pressed close to the seam where metal met frame, inhaling in short, tight pulls. Her ears flicked once, twice, not at voices, but at something deeper, an interior hum, a vibration in the building's bones. Claire remembered Owen's words from earlier, faint and broken, the sound of a fan, a service tunnel. Luna's posture changed from searching to confirming, and she glanced back at Heller as if to say, "Here, this is not just smell, this is presence." Delgado stepped in beside Jonah, careful to keep distance. "That corridor shouldn't be in the student flow," he said. "If someone used it to move equipment, or people, it's the perfect blind spot." Jonah nodded slowly, eyes narrowed, connecting lines. He requested access logs from campus security, and within minutes a nervous technician produced a printout, hands shaking in the cold. The entries were messy, time-stamped, peppered with gaps. But one pattern stood out. Repeated late-night swipes at the maintenance entrance, clustered around lab hours that didn't match any class schedule. Jonah didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply pointed to the timestamps and said, "We're going to need a warrant for expanded search areas, including auxiliary facilities tied to this access route." Captain Anders approached, her stance firm. "We can't clear that corridor until we confirm air quality," she said. "But we can map it. Service tunnels often connect to external utility sheds." Her finger traced an outline on a campus map like she was drawing the skeleton under the skin. Luna sat at the door seam, steady and unmoving, as if guarding it with her body alone. Claire watched the dog and felt a strange flicker of faith. Faith not in systems, not in speeches, but in instinct sharpened into purpose. Across the lot, Dr. Rowe continued talking to cameras, smiling, performing relief. Claire's gaze flicked to the building again, then to Luna. The dog's attention never wavered from that corridor. It was as if she had found the thread in a tangled knot and refused to let it go. Jonah folded the access log and slid it into a folder, his face calm but his voice lower when he spoke to Claire. "This is bigger than a spill," he said. "If Owen was right and you were followed, we're not dealing with negligence. We're dealing with people who move in shadows." Claire swallowed, feeling the familiar pull to take control, to sprint ahead. But she didn't. She stayed where she was supposed to stay, because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone in the fight. When Hazmat finally guided Luna through a quick decon, spray, wipe, careful rinse. Heller murmured praise under his breath, and the dog accepted it without excitement, as if praise was not why she worked. Jonah handed Captain Anders the mapped route data, and Delgado began calling in chemical procurement checks. The plan formed the way winter ice forms on a lake, quiet, steady, undeniable. There was a service line leading outward, away from the student areas, toward auxiliary structures beyond the main building. A place where someone could hide movement behind infrastructure. A place that would require a warrant, a coordinated search, and speed. Luna looked toward the trees beyond the campus boundary, ears angled, as if she could already smell where the story went next. By afternoon, Reynolds Hall had become two worlds stacked on top of each other. Outside, winter sun made the snow look harmless, almost festive, reflecting light so bright it forced people to squint. Inside, behind taped perimeters and masked faces, the building carried an invisible cruelty that turned throats raw and eyes to tears. Claire stayed in the warm zone where Captain Mia Anders had ordered her to remain, a boundary marked by cones, caution tape, and the strict language of safety. She could feel the old temptation to step forward anyway. Her body remembered the Bureau's rhythm, the itch to push into the hottest part of a problem and wrestle it into submission. But Jonah Pike's presence anchored her. He moved with the quiet competence of someone who understood that courage without procedure was just another way to get people killed. He carried a clipboard and a radio, but his real tool was his restraint. DEA agent Rafe Delgado stood nearby, hunched slightly against the cold, scanning a tablet with tired eyes as if he'd been reading human excuses since sunrise. "We've got records of benzyl chloride orders routed through the chemistry department," he said, voice low. "Nothing illegal on paper. That's the trick. It's the pattern that's wrong, the quantities, the timing, and who signed for them." He flicked his gaze toward the building, toward the cameras still hovering at a distance. "And somebody's trying real hard to make this look like an accident." Dr. Elias Rowe continued performing for the press at the edge of the cordon, coat collar turned up, silver-streaked hair neat, beard trimmed into the illusion of thoughtful integrity. He spoke with the kind of confidence that made ordinary people relax. Soft smile, open hands, gentle concern. Claire watched him and felt the familiar chill of recognition. She'd seen men like this in interrogation rooms, the ones who didn't raise their voices because they didn't need to. Their power came from being believed. And Rowe looked like a man addicted to being believed. Inside the warm zone, Deputy Tom Heller kept Luna on a short lead. Even after decon, the German Shepherd's focus hadn't dimmed. Her sable coat was still damp in places from the rinse, darker along her spine, and the sunlight caught the tan around her legs in warm flashes. She looked lean and efficient, her muscles moving under her fur like a machine built for purpose. She didn't beg for affection or act frantic. She worked. When she breathed in, her nostrils flared slightly, and her ears twitched not at voices, but at airflow, as if she could feel the building's lungs. Claire caught herself staring at the dog the way some people stared at a chapel candle. Quietly, as if the flame might teach them something about endurance. Jonah finally got the access logs and partial camera feeds from campus security. The footage was disappointing in the way criminals preferred. Blind spots where a hallway camera should have been. A maintenance door whose angle showed only a sliver of movement. Still, patterns emerged. Repeated swipes, odd hour entries. A service corridor that shouldn't have been used at all after midnight. "It's not enough by itself," Jonah murmured, jaw tight. But with Owen's statement, the glove from the tree line, and K9 indication, it starts to look like probable cause. He spoke like a man building a bridge over a gorge, one plank at a time, refusing to step until it could hold weight. Captain Anders approached, posture firm, her braided hair hidden under her hood, voice steady. "We're going to test that maintenance branch for residual vapor," she said. "If it's feeding into an auxiliary line, it could connect to external utility sheds or a service tunnel. That's outside the main building envelope. Easier to hide movement, easier to hide people." Claire heard the last word and felt the inside of her ribs tighten. People, not just chemicals, not just paperwork. Two men were somewhere in the dark of this infrastructure, breathing whatever air their captors allowed them. A sudden hiss burst from the maintenance corridor like a giant exhale, sharp, wet, and wrong, and a thin white plume rolled outward, catching the sunlight in a ghostly ribbon. Claire's eyes burned instantly as if someone had rubbed pepper into them, and her lungs seized in a cough that stole her balance for one terrifying second. The world tilted, bright snow and red cones blurring into a spinning smear, and in that suspended moment she felt the old, familiar terror of being out of control. Then Luna hit her. Not hard, not violent, just decisive. The dog's shoulder pressed into Claire's thigh like a brace, her muzzle hooked briefly at the sleeve of Claire's coat, pulling her backward as Tom Heller shouted, and Jonah lunged forward. "Back! Back! Warm zone line!" Captain Anders barked, already moving, already signaling her team. Jonah's gloved hand caught Claire's elbow, guiding her away as if he could physically steer her back into safety. Tom yanked Luna to heel with a firm command, not to punish her, but to keep her from stepping into a hazard. The hazmat crew sealed the corridor door again and began air sampling with the calm, ruthless efficiency of people trained to fight what they couldn't see. Claire's eyes streamed. She coughed until her throat felt scraped raw. And through it all, Luna held her gaze for one brief second, ears forward, expression intent, as if saying, "You are not falling today." They brought Claire to the decon station, even though she had only been exposed for seconds. Warm water, measured spray, wipes for her hands and sleeves, a clean towel pressed to her face. Captain Anders supervised without drama, but her eyes held a stern kindness. "You don't get points for suffering," she said. "You get points for living." Claire nodded, embarrassed by how close she'd come to losing her footing, physically and emotionally. She hated that weakness still found her. But a smaller part of her, the part that had been hollowed by failure, felt something else too. Gratitude. Not the soft, sentimental kind, the fierce kind that made you want to deserve the help you were given. When Claire's vision cleared, she watched as Luna returned to work, still controlled, still purposeful. Deputy Heller guided her along the outer perimeter of the service corridor, letting her indicate without entering the hot zone. Luna's body language changed in small, precise ways. A pause at a seam, a slight lean toward an exterior wall, a focused inhale that ended with her sitting rigidly, her trained signal. "She's telling us the airflow is strongest here," Heller said quietly. "And she's picking up something else. Human scent, maybe, mixed under the chemical." Jonah's eyes narrowed. He didn't smile, but his voice carried a low, sober confidence when he spoke into his radio. "Field office, I need expedited warrant request for auxiliary structures tied to Reynolds Hall service line. We have K9 indications at multiple points, corroborated by access logs and evidence recovered off-site." Delgado stepped closer, tapping his tablet. "And I can link procurement anomalies to Rowe's lab budget line," he said. "Not a smoking gun, but it strengthens the story." Across the lot, Dr. Rowe's polished voice continued floating toward cameras, soothing and smooth. Yet Claire noticed his eyes now, quick, restless flashes toward the building whenever Hazmat shifted position. A man watching his stage from the wings, terrified the curtain might lift too early. Sheriff Nora Kincaid arrived again with 2 deputies, faces tight with urgency. She spoke low to Jonah. "We just got a call from County Dispatch," she said. "Anonymous tip. Says they're moving the cargo tonight." Her mouth hardened around the last word. "Could be a prank, could be real, but if your SEAL hostages are the cargo—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. The implication hung in the winter air heavier than any plume. Jonah didn't hesitate. He stepped aside, made the call that mattered, and when he returned his eyes were steady. "Field office is approving tactical prep," he said. "HRT is gearing up. We move fast, but we move right." Claire looked at Luna, still seated at the wall seam like a carved statue, guarding a truth hidden inside concrete and metal. The dog's chest rose and fell, calm, unwavering. Claire felt something inside her shift, not a miracle, not a full healing, but a small, stubborn alignment. Maybe she had failed once. Maybe she had been broken by it. But here, in this bright, cold world, she was being handed another chance to stand her ground with help at her side. Night settled over the ridge like a lid, quiet and heavy, turning the world outside Claire's cabin into a black and silver painting. Snow reflected moonlight in soft sheets, and the lake far below was only a darker shape beneath the sky. Inside, warmth fought the cold with the honest crackle of the stove. Owen lay on the couch under layered blankets, color returning slowly to his face, but the bruise at his temple looked darker under lamplight, like a storm cloud that had chosen to stay. He was still strong, even in weakness, broad shoulders, thick hands, the kind of build that didn't come from a gym but from years of carrying real weight. His dark stubble had grown rougher through the day, and his eyes, when they opened, moved with the same trained precision as before, tracking door, window, corners, as if the cabin were a perimeter he could memorize into safety. Claire sat at the table with a mug she hadn't drunk from, listening to Jonah Pike speak in low tones to Sheriff Nora Kincaid over a phone on speaker. Claire's leave status was no longer a question tonight. It was a boundary Jonah kept for her like a guardrail. "You stay inside," he had told her earlier, calm but unyielding. "You're witness and protected party. You do not become the story again." Sheriff Nora's voice came through crisp and controlled. "My deputies are staged 2 roads down. No lights, no sirens. If they come up your drive, we'll know." The sheriff's steadiness sounded like the kind of faith people built in small towns. Not loud, not sentimental, but reliable. Jonah's response was equally measured. "HRT is mobilizing. We need time. If anyone approaches, we stall. We don't escalate. No hero moves." It was strange, hearing the words that had once defined Claire's life spoken in a new way. She'd spent years being the one who moved first. Now she was learning the harder skill, holding still while others carried the risk. Luna lay near the front door on a folded blanket Tom Heller had dropped off earlier, her sable coat dry again, her ears twitching at every small shift in the wind. The dog looked like a statue until she didn't. When Owen's breathing changed, her head lifted. When a branch tapped the window, her gaze snapped to it. She was 5 years old and built for work, lean but powerful, her tan legs tucked beneath her, her dark saddle blending into the shadows. She had saved Owen once today, and saved Claire too, and now she guarded the cabin like it was her post. Every so often, she glanced at Claire with a seriousness that felt almost human, an animal's devotion translated into duty. They had moved the evidence earlier, the one piece Jonah believed might be the thread that tied everything together. Owen hadn't named it in full sentences. He couldn't. But he'd pointed to his chest and whispered, "They think it's here." A small drive, a memory card, a clip, something that turned suspicion into certainty. Jonah had taken it, sealed it, and sent it with a deputy down the hill toward a secure locker at the sheriff's office. That was the difference between panic and procedure. Proof didn't help if it got stolen back. The porch light clicked on. Claire's body tensed as if it had been struck. Luna rose in one smooth motion, silent, and moved to the door. Her head lowered. A low growl vibrated from her chest, not loud, not frantic, controlled. Owen's eyes opened instantly, and Claire saw the flash of guilt in them, sharp as glass. He knew what this might be. He knew who would come. A single crunch sounded outside, one deliberate footstep on frozen snow, followed by the faint metallic jingle of keys, and then a soft tap against the porch rail, as if someone had tested the wood to see if it would answer. The cabin seemed to pause around that sound. Even the stove's crackle felt distant. Claire held her breath without meaning to, and in that suspended silence a strange thought rose like a prayer she didn't know she still believed. Let the right help arrive in time. Let this dog be enough until then. Jonah wasn't inside the cabin. He'd positioned himself down the drive with Nora's deputies, watching the approach point without giving away their presence. Claire had only one job now: keep Owen alive, keep herself steady, and do nothing that dragged the danger into the room. She moved quietly to the back window and peered through a narrow gap in the curtain. 2 figures were climbing the drive. They moved like men who believed the night belonged to them. No hesitation, no confusion. One was tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark parka that looked expensive even in the dim light, his beanie pulled low, his face partly hidden by a trimmed beard. The other was thinner, restless, his shoulders hunched, hands buried in pockets, head swiveling as if he hated the quiet. Even from a distance, Claire could feel the difference in their energy. The first man carried control like a weapon. The second carried impatience like a leak. They stopped at the porch. The tall one knocked, firm, measured, the sound of a man expecting compliance. Luna's growl deepened, and Owen shifted as if he might sit up. Claire pressed a hand lightly against his shoulder. "Don't," she whispered, not harsh, just absolute. Owen swallowed, jaw tight, eyes burning with a mix of anger and shame. The knock came again. Then a voice, smooth and practiced, drifting through the door like smoke. "We know you're in there. We just want what belongs to us." The words were polite, but the threat was folded neatly inside them. Claire's heart hammered once, then steadied. Fear wasn't new. She'd lived with it for months. Tonight, she would not let it run the room. She reached for her phone and sent a single text to Jonah, 2 words and a location pin: "On porch." Outside, the thinner man muttered something, and the taller one hushed him with a small motion. Luna stood with her body angled toward the door, blocking it with her presence, as if she were a barricade made of bone and loyalty. Her ears were forward, her eyes bright. Claire realized, with a tight ache, that the dog was doing more than guarding. She was buying time. She was holding a line the way Owen once held lines overseas. A different battlefield. Same principle. Minutes stretched. The men tried the doorknob once, gently at first, then harder. The bolt held. Claire heard Jonah's voice outside suddenly, calm and loud enough to carry, not close yet, but approaching along the drive with purpose. "Sheriff's Department, step away from the door." A flashlight beam cut through the trees, then another. Nora's deputies emerged like shadows turned solid, weapons trained but disciplined, voices firm. The tall man lifted his hands slowly, almost amused, as if this were an inconvenience rather than a crisis. The thinner one froze, eyes darting like a trapped animal. Jonah kept distance, not rushing the confrontation, letting the standoff do its work. "You're trespassing," he said. "You're done." The taller man smiled thinly. "We're just looking for a friend." Jonah didn't rise to it. He didn't argue. He simply held the line until sirens sounded far off, kept low, approaching without drama. The men exchanged a look, calculation shifting. They realized they'd lost the element they needed most. Control. They retreated, not running, but stepping back into the darkness with the promise of return written in their posture. Nora's deputies didn't chase blindly into trees. They held position, marked direction, radioed updates. Jonah glanced once toward the cabin window, meeting Claire's eyes through the glass. His look was steady. "You did right. You stayed inside. You held." As the vehicles repositioned, Jonah leaned toward Nora, speaking in a low burst. "They came for proof," he said, "which means proof exists. And if they're bold enough to come here, they're moving the hostages now." Nora nodded once, grim. Her radio crackled with an update from a deputy posted near the highway. Suspicious movement on a service road leading toward the university's outer utility structures. Jonah's posture tightened. He lifted his phone, made a call, and Claire heard only one phrase through the cold night when he spoke. "We have eyes on the route. Send HRT." Inside, Owen exhaled like he'd been holding air for hours. Luna returned to the door, sat and kept watching, not satisfied, not relaxed. Claire walked to her and knelt, resting a hand near the dog's shoulder without touching. Luna's gaze flicked to her, steady, then back to the dark. Claire understood. The dog wasn't celebrating survival. She was waiting for completion. By the time Jonah returned to the porch, the night had sharpened, and the snow glowed under headlights like scattered salt. "We've got a location," he told Claire through the cracked door, voice controlled. "Auxiliary service site off the campus line. HRT is rolling now." Claire felt her knees go weak with relief she didn't trust, and she steadied herself against the doorframe. Owen's eyes closed briefly, not in sleep, but in a silent promise to his trapped teammates. And somewhere in the trees beyond the lights, the world kept turning, indifferent. But inside that small circle of warmth, a dog, a wounded man, and a woman who had been hiding from her own memories had held the line long enough for help to move. The rescue did not begin with hero speeches or dramatic music. It began with cold air, clipped radio traffic, and men and women moving through darkness as if silence itself were part of the plan. Jonah Pike stood at the edge of a staging area near the university's auxiliary service site, an ugly sprawl of utility sheds and service tunnels set back from the student buildings, built for pipes and power, not people. Floodlights were kept low and angled down. Tires crunched softly on packed snow. The HRT team arrived in unmarked vehicles, their gear matte and practical, their movements disciplined enough to look almost gentle. The team leader, a tall man in his late 30s named Grant Soloway, had a lean face with sharp cheekbones and a close-cropped haircut that made his eyes look even more awake. He spoke with a quiet, measured authority that suggested he had learned the hard way that adrenaline was not a strategy. His jaw carried a thin scar along the left side, and he didn't bother explaining it. People like him rarely did. He listened to Jonah's summary, access logs, blind camera angles, the glove with chemical trace, the service corridor's airflow indicators, Owen's description of fan noise, and a utility route. And he nodded once as if the case file had become a map. Owen was there too, but not in the role his muscles wanted. He stood in a heated vehicle under medical supervision, wrapped in a jacket that still looked too clean on him, his shoulders tense as wire. His eyes were clearer now, his color steadier, but the anger beneath his skin was fresh and bright. He wanted to be the one going in. He wanted to pay back the night. Claire stood beside him, not as the lead agent, not as a tactical asset, but as the person who had been pulled back from a chemical breath and given a second chance to stay alive. She looked paler than usual under the harsh staging lights, her dark hair tucked beneath a knit cap, her blue-gray eyes fixed on the utility structures with a steadiness that had returned slowly, like warmth seeping back into fingers after frost. She didn't try to sound brave. She simply stayed present. Luna was not there yet. That was deliberate. Procedure mattered. Safety mattered. No dog went in before the zone was controlled. Sheriff Nora Kincaid helped coordinate perimeter units, her posture straight, her breath turning to fog. She had the calm focus of someone who had spent years arriving first and staying last, and tonight she held her deputies to discipline. No chasing shadows, no impatient moves. DEA agent Rafe Delgado stayed with the evidence team, eyes on chain of custody, because the goal was not just to rescue living men, though that was the urgent miracle, but to hold the truth in court when the adrenaline faded. Captain Mia Anders and her hazmat crew waited in the cold zone with decon gear ready, masks up, hands steady, because benzyl chloride did not care about bravery. It only cared about contact. HRT moved. They cut power to non-essential lines. They watched the tunnel vents for changes in airflow. They used quiet tools and quieter patience. Jonah listened to the radio, hearing doors breach in controlled bursts, hearing the measured language of professionals. Clear. Hold. Left corridor. Contact possible. Claire stood with her hands clenched inside her gloves, fighting the old spiral of imagining worst outcomes. In her mind, she saw two men in a dark room, Owen's teammates, breathing stale air, waiting for footsteps that might mean death or rescue. She had learned in therapy that the mind could torture itself with images and call it preparation. Tonight, she tried something different. She tried prayer without ceremony, not a show. A whisper inside her chest. Please, God, let them be alive when the door opens. A single muffled thud echoed through the utility shed, followed by a sharp metallic clatter like something heavy striking concrete. And then, in the thin gap between radio updates, Claire heard it. A human shout, ragged and raw, not from a speaker, but from inside the structure itself. The sound punched through her ribs. For one frozen heartbeat, she didn't breathe. Then Jonah's radio crackled. We've got them. 2 alive. Medical moving in. Claire's knees went weak, and she caught herself on the vehicle door, tears stinging her eyes in a way that had nothing to do with chemicals this time. The hostages came out wrapped in blankets and escorted by medics. 2 Navy SEALs with faces drawn tight by exhaustion, wrists red from restraints, eyes blinking hard against light like men resurfacing from deep water. One was named Marcus Hale, mid-30s, broad and thick-necked, with dark skin and a shaved head that made him look carved out of stone. His expression was fierce even through fatigue, the kind of man whose humor probably showed up only after trust was earned. The other was Evan Cross, early 30s, lighter build, sandy hair grown too long, a thin cut split at the corner of his mouth. His eyes were startlingly gentle for a soldier, the kind that suggested he'd seen enough to value softness without losing strength. When Owen saw them, his face cracked in the smallest, most human way. A tight exhale that sounded like grief finally letting go. He stepped forward, but medics held him back until they cleared the area. Marcus's gaze locked on Owen and held. Evan lifted a hand, weak but steady, as if saying, We're here. We made it. Only after the site was secured did Luna arrive, on leash, guided by Deputy Tom Heller. The dog's sable coat caught the staging lights in warm brown and black. She moved with contained urgency, nose working, ears forward. When Heller gave the command, she swept the cleared area, indicating a small interior office space where a hidden panel had been used to stash items, packaging, a burner phone, and a notebook with chemical notes that made Delgado's eyes sharpen. Luna's work didn't replace the rescue. It sealed it. It made sure the story didn't vanish into lack of evidence the moment the sirens stopped. In the weeks that followed, the case unfolded like most real endings do. Part victory, part ache. Dr. Elias Rowe confessed under pressure that came not from one dramatic reveal, but from converging facts: procurement patterns, lab access anomalies, residue detection, and his own ego. His office yielded the embarrassing artifacts of obsession: a Heisenberg mug, a printout of a chemistry article praising a certain TV show for realism, notes that read like a man trying to cosplay genius into criminality. He lost his career, served time, and faced restitution that would follow him like a shadow. Terry Bateman, the lab manager, remained clean on paper. No direct residue, no fingerprints on contraband, no moment caught on camera. The criminal charges didn't stick. But the consequences did not vanish. The university fired him. Civil suits followed. The town argued in diners and church basements about fairness, about loopholes, about how often the truth arrived wearing imperfect clothes. North Lake State University paid in money and reputation. Reynolds Hall underwent decontamination that cost more than anyone wanted to admit. New chemical controls came down like winter rules: locked inventories, surprise audits, DEA checks that made even honest professors sigh. The campus learned painfully that knowledge was not the same as wisdom. For Claire and Owen, healing did not happen in a montage. Owen spent months rebuilding strength, physical therapy, sleep that came in patches, anger that softened only when he stopped punishing himself for what he couldn't control. Claire stayed in treatment too, learning to live with memory without letting it drive. Their relationship grew the way stable things grow, quietly through repeated choices. He showed up for her on hard days without demanding explanations. She learned how to lean without feeling weak. Luna stayed close, watchful, but calmer, as if her mission had evolved from emergency into belonging. By the next summer, Lake Superior looked nothing like that rescue night. The water shone blue under a wide sky. The town church stood small and white with its simple steeple, doors open to warm air and sunlight. Claire walked down the aisle in a modest dress, her hair softly pinned back, her eyes clear. Owen waited at the front in a suit that didn't hide his soldier's posture, but didn't need to. Sheriff Nora sat in the front pew, smiling like someone who had seen enough darkness to cherish ordinary joy. Jonah Pike stood off to the side, quiet, hands folded, looking relieved in a way he would never say out loud. Luna stood near the altar like an honor guard, still, attentive, sable coat, gleaming, eyes steady. When Claire reached Owen and their hands met, the dog's ears flicked once, as if she had marked the moment the way she once marked threats. Only now the thing she guarded was peace. Outside, sunlight lay across the lake in a long, bright path. Claire didn't feel the need to hide in silence anymore. Owen didn't feel like surviving had to be solitary. And Luna, the dog who had pulled a wounded man through snow and pushed a trembling woman back from poison, closed her mission with the quiet dignity of rest, proof that sometimes destiny arrives on four paws and love finishes what duty began. In the end, this story isn't really about a university building, a chemical spill, or even a dramatic rescue. It's about how God can use the smallest, most unexpected messengers to break through the walls we build around our pain. A wounded man found help not because the world suddenly became kind, but because a faithful dog refused to accept too late. A woman who hid on a hill to escape her memories was pulled back into purpose by a creature that could not speak, yet somehow spoke the truth with every step, every warning, every act of loyalty. There's a lesson here that many of us learn the hard way. Strength is not only what we do in a crisis. Strength is what we do afterward, when life gets quiet again and we still choose to show up. Healing is not a switch you flip. It is a road you walk, sometimes slowly, sometimes with tears in your eyes, but always forward. If you've ever felt ashamed of needing help, remember this. Even the strongest people in this story survived because they stopped trying to carry everything alone. Pride isolates, but love brings community. And sometimes the community God sends first has 4 paws and a brave heart. And let's talk about animals, because they are not just background in our lives. They are often mirrors of what we forget to be: loyal without applause, protective without bitterness, brave without ego. When a dog senses danger before a human mind can name it, it feels like instinct. But sometimes it also feels like providence, as if God placed that animal in that exact moment to stand between life and tragedy. That is why we must never treat animals with cruelty or neglect. Be kind to them, feed them, protect them, speak gently to them, and never underestimate their hearts. The way we treat the vulnerable, whether it's a child, a neighbor, or a dog shivering in the cold, reveals who we truly are. In everyday life, most of us won't face a tactical rescue or a midnight standoff. But we will face smaller choices that shape our character just as much. A phone call you've been putting off, a neighbor you know is lonely, a family member who needs patience, a stray animal on the roadside, a tired cashier who could use a smile. These are the moments where love becomes real, and often the miracle is not thunder in the sky, but a softened heart, a timely decision, a hand that reaches out instead of turning away. God works through compassion. God works through courage. God works through ordinary people who decide to do the right thing when it would be easier to stay silent. If this story touched something in you, don't let that feeling fade when the video ends. Carry it into your week. Choose one act of kindness today that costs you something small: time, attention, pride, comfort. And if you have an animal in your life, give them extra care, because their loyalty is a gift, not a guarantee. Let this be your reminder that mercy is never wasted, and love, even when it begins in fear, can grow into something that saves more than one life. Thank you for spending this time with us. Please share this story with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what part of the story spoke to your heart. And if you want more stories of faith, loyalty, redemption, and the quiet miracles that still happen in this world, subscribe to the channel and stay with this community. May God bless you, protect your home, strengthen your heart, and guide your steps every day.